In the 1830s, two talented painters, George Catlin and Karl Bodmer, journeyed into the West and left the future a marvelous body of artwork. Time machine visuals that enable us now to form an evocative sense of the early West and its primary characters. I'm Dan Flores, and this is The American West. Brought to you by Velvet Buck. Still in barrel, Velvet Buck arrives this summer, just in time for the season that calls us home. A portion of every bottle supports backcountry hunters and anglers to protect public lands, waters, and wildlife. Enjoy responsibly. Catlin's and Bodmer's Time Machine Visuals. A few years ago, when high summer burned its brief, bright flame in Montana's Glacier National Park, a friend and I loaded up our backpacks and headed off for the northern Rockies backcountry. During that narrow window in Glacier between July high water and late August snow, you can ford the rivers on sunny mornings and sleep under star-spangled mountain skies. So my buddy and I spent 4 days backpacking across the park from its western boundary to Blackfeet lands on its eastern one. In my mind's eye, those 4 days still emerge in fair detail. The adrenaline surge of crossing the Flathead River with a full backpack, the thunder and spray of Nyack Falls, miles of slogging through neck-high huckleberry bushes in the best grizzly habitat left on Earth, and high-elevation nights with stars polished to brilliance. There was also the Technicolor panorama from atop Cutbank Pass and an unintentional glissade down a snowfield, which could have ended badly had I not pulled out a stand-up slide into second base from a past life. No one drowned in the Flathead River, was rushed by a grizzly, toppled off a glacier, or got struck by lightning amongst the peaks. Beyond my memories, I preserved this adventure the way we all do now, with photographs. What still photographs lack in recreating the past, of course, is the ability to engage all the human senses. Nyack Falls is a marvel in my shots of it, but since this backpack predated smartphones, the falls stand mute in my photos, their crashing thunder now irretrievable. I have one photo from day 2 of fresh grizzly scat in our trail, but I only dimly recall the primary sensory effect, which naturally was the redolent, earthy scent of half-hour-old bear shit. It's fortunate that we humans evolved to be such a visual species, though, because I can still conjure a sense of this boundary-to-boundary hike in Glacier purely from images. That knowledge helps me put aside any disappointment that when we try to reach back in time and touch the early West, our best time machine for that engages just one sense: the visual record. A record left to us by artists who were adventurous and talented enough to make us believe sometimes that we're standing there beside them in the West of the 1830s or 1840s. The two time machine guys, I think, are the very best for setting me down in their time and in the places they saw are George Catlin and Karl Bodmer. Let me tell you a little bit about each of them and why time perusing the images they left the future just might be hours you don't have to deduct from your allotted span on Earth. Sometime in the past half-century, George Catlin managed to be modestly rediscovered. That's something of a miracle for a 19th century man whose lifetime work was once stored away in a boiler factory, then forgotten and left to nearly ruin there. But nowadays, most people interested in the West and its story know Catlin's name and might have a hazy notion of his career, even if the depth of understanding is about on a par with having heard of Van Gogh enough to know that he cut off his ear. Cocktail party conversation may not get at exactly why this Western artist was so passionate about Indians, and the Dutch one so committed to slicing and dicing his anatomy, but Catlin does have name recognition. In Catlin's case, name recognition probably has more to do with his subject matter than with his life. Americans have a powerful fascination with Native people. From the time of the Boston Tea Party down to the last Grateful Dead concerts, Americans have been cross-dressing as Indians and sometimes even calling on the Native story to help figure out our national identity. So most of us are prepared to understand Catlin's mission as a painter, which was obsessive enough to have inspired Herman Melville in developing the character of Captain Ahab. Because Catlin wrote as well as painted, we know a lot about that obsession, which he described this way. I sat out alone, unaided and unadvised, resolved, if my life should be spared, by the aid of my brush and pen, to rescue from oblivion so much of the Indians' looks and customs as the industry and ardent enthusiasm of one lifetime could accomplish. He wrote that he sought to record nothing less than true and facsimile traces of individual life and historical facts. He put that phrase in italics to emphasize it. That goal seems noble, maybe more than a touch romantic. In Catlin's case, romance was so embedded that he struck his peers, fellow painters who also went west, like Alfred Jacob Miller, John James Audubon, and yes, Karl Bodmer, as a fraud. Humbug was the favored one-word put-down. Miller, who'd visited some of the same tribes shortly after Catlin, used it, and so did Audubon, who was on the Missouri River a decade after Catlin. Bodmer actually advised European friends to avoid Catlin's exhibition, the Indian Gallery, which in the 1840s was the first traveling Western show ever to tour Europe. As for Audubon, he wrote of Catlin, "I pity him. He could have been an honest man." What did criticism like this mean? Was George Catlin the first person to devote his life to showing the world the West, its prairies, its great herds and their predators, its villages of graceful teepees, its rivers and mesas and badlands truly dishonest in what he portrayed? Were his competitors just expressing jealousy at the success he enjoyed with a European tour? Envy, I think, especially in the case of Audubon and Bodmer, had something to do with it. But there may have been something else going on. I believe Catlin saw the West both with his eyes and with his heart, by which I mean he had an empathetic sensitivity. Catlin obviously had a keen and discerning eye, but more than anything else, he was sympathetic to Native people at a time when that was not a common reaction for many Americans. Nothing Catlin ever did was easy, and that may be one of the reasons he was able to empathize with others. He was born in the Wyoming Valley near Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania in 1796, and as a young man trained as a lawyer in Connecticut. Like most of us do, by his mid-20s, he'd changed his mind about his future and found that his true bliss lay in painting, in visual representations of the world. So he attached himself to the Pennsylvania Academy in Philadelphia, studying to become a history painter in the tradition of European academic style. At the same time, he fashioned a sort of starving artist's existence, painting miniature portraits, a skill he would fall back on many times in his life among the Indians. As he learned about art, he also absorbed the heady world of Philadelphia at a time when America was blooming and starting to embrace a sense of America as separate from Europe, even exceptional. Catlin was lucky enough to find himself in sync with America's new view of itself, even capable of articulating a version of that Europeans could love. The United States was hungry for some way to identify itself as distinct from the old world, and America's wild natural world, along with its indigenous inhabitants, neither of which characterized Europe, seemed to offer the best chance for that. As Catlin and other Americans studied painting, Writers like William Bartram, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Washington Irving, James Fenimore Cooper, and Henry David Thoreau already were at work on a body of literature that would wrap the story of wild nature, Indians, and western adventuring into the country's new definition of itself. What Catlin and his contemporaries were witnessing were the stirrings of American Romanticism. Romanticism had begun in Europe and was another one of its exports, but in Catlin's age, it took on an American life of its own. One element of Romanticism that landed on fertile soil here was the new idea that wild nature wasn't the haunt of demons or hobgoblins at all, but in fact was the freshest manifestation of God. So people living in close proximity to nature were especially graced. Thoreau, as always, was a quick study. Is not nature, rightly read, that for which she is commonly taken to be the symbol merely, he wrote. Isn't nature, in other words, the deity itself? That idea's deep internalization in the American psyche explains a lot of big-picture American history, like national parks and our wilderness system, both of which were global firsts. As for the idea that humans living in a state of nature were blessed, or noble savages, that had a rockier trajectory in a country trying to displace the natives. When Catlin made his first great western journey up the Missouri River in his quest to become the historian of the Indian, as he put it, his eyes saw the Great Plains clearly, and his romantic heart perceived the resident natives as living in a divine state of nature. Catlin thus was willing to make two conceptualizations that set him apart from most of his American contemporaries who were interpreting Romanticism quite differently. For one, in 1832, Catlin found the Great Plains an entirely deserving and even inspiring romantic landscape. Most of the rest of America followed the European tradition and searched for romantic country in the Catskills or the Rockies, vertical terrain that reached to the divine heavens, which the horizontal Yellow Plains decidedly didn't. Catlin's painter contemporaries back east were thoroughly immersed in the mountain as the be-all and end-all of romantic scenery. So how interesting it was that in 1832, George Catlin painted the curvaceous, shadow-filled plains as a soul-melting country. To my eye, like a fairyland, he wrote. Journeying up the Missouri aboard a fur company steamboat, the Yellowstone, Catlin executed one romantic landscape painting after another. Two Catlins I've always lingered over to penetrate time and visually experience the West of the 1830s are Big Bend on the upper Missouri above St. Louis and the brick kilns, clay bluffs above St. Louis. These are horizontal romantic landscapes. Catlin's time machine visuals make abundantly clear that the three predominant characters of the 19th century West were its remarkable landscapes, the most picturesque and beautiful shapes and colors imaginable, he said, a blessed native people, and a diverse and charismatic wildlife. Finding himself among those three, but with a gnawing anxiety about what was coming in the future for all of them, led him to a logical conclusion. George Catlin was the first American to call for the creation of a Western National Park. Here's how he put that. And what a splendid contemplation, too, when one who has traveled these realms and can duly appreciate them imagines them as they might in future be seen by some great protecting policy of government, preserved in their pristine beauty and wildness in a magnificent park. It was Catlin's next bold step that I think shows why he suffered attacks from some of his contemporaries. He went on to argue that in such a park, the world could see for ages to come the native Indian in his classic attire, galloping his wild horse with sinewy bow and shield and lance, amid the fleeting herds of elks and buffaloes. What a beautiful and thrilling specimen for America to preserve and hold up to the view of her refined citizens and the world in future ages, a nation's park containing man and beast in all the wild and freshness of their nature's beauty. Exactly here is where Catlin broke ranks with most of his contemporaries. Most Americans expected Indians to melt away, to perform a vanishing act in a civilized America. Andrew Jackson's administration was already removing Indians from the East. But if you engage Catlin's time machine visuals and study the great portraits he painted of these Missouri River peoples, the Blackfeet leader, Buffalo Bull's Backfat, and his wife, Crystal Stone, Eagle Ribs, one of the extraordinary men of the Blackfoot tribe, Catlin said, the Crow, Four Wolves, who carries himself with the most graceful and manly mien. They tell another truth of Romanticism. All these people were noble children of nature. When he wrote of them in his classic book, Letters and Notes on the North American Indians, Catlin compared them to the ancient Britons or to the Greeks of Homer's literature. In their wildness and romance and color, as he put it, America's native people were worthy of admiration, and by all that was right and romantic, they ought to endure in America. This is where George Catlin was most exposed, and his empathetic heart does not resemble Alfred Jacob Miller's or Audubon's or, it seems, the universal and not very sympathetic heart of 19th century America. The Swiss Karl Bodmer, whose time machine visuals I want to take up next, knew damn well he was a much better painter than Catlin, yet he struggled to have his work recognized and most likely was jealous of Catlin's successes with his fellow Europeans. But the Americans, Miller and Audubon, saw the same northern plains and native people Catlin did, yet a different alchemy played out. For both of them, true American noble savages weren't Indians, but Euro-Americans gone native, like Daniel Boone or the mountain men Miller promoted for that role. As for Audubon, who sneered at Catlin's infatuation with Indians, he seems to have believed that the iconic American child of nature should be John James Audubon. So Audubon toured Europe with flowing hair, dressed in fringed buckskins to present the Old Worlders a non-Indian American noble savage. My other candidate for archdruid of the early Western time machine was not American but Swiss. And like Catlin, what he did, so critical to a visual species like us, was to paint a record in full color splendor of almost all he saw in the 1830s West. His name was Karl Bodmer. Before I describe Bodmer's wondrous talents and the grand adventure that elicited them, let me make the visual case just a bit better. On our Glacier Park traverse, my buddy and I both kept journals, fairly full written accounts. Yet the 70 or so photos I shot stand as a far more potent way for me, or for someone else, to relive the experience. I notice when I read it now that my journal mostly captures my daily emotional states. But the visual record retrieves what the country looked like, the shape we were in, how other hikers appeared, the reactions of wildlife, our camp scenes. I'm a writer, but I didn't write down many of those things. Visuals of the world are precisely what Bodmer, who had barely turned 24 when he started up the Missouri River in the year 1833, was able to bring to an early West that's now a ghostly apparition, the baseline world, beneath all the subsequent change. It's our great fortune down the timeline that Bodmer, who is even more obscure than Catlin, brought to his adventure both the prodigious energy of youth and a talent that far outstripped that of any other painter in the West until the Civil War and after. Bodmer's good fortune was the adventure itself, which came as a gift of patronage from the naturalist adventurer Prince Maximilian of Wied-Neuwied, one of the great Alexander von Humboldt's prized pupils. At the time he met Maximilian, Bodmer was training with an artist's uncle in Prussia and getting by as a painter of rivers and castles. Maximilian, for his part, had already made a 2-year trek to Brazil and was planning his next great adventure to the interior regions of the Missouri in Northern America, as he put it. Brazil had taught Maximilian an important lesson. He wrote a colleague, "I would want to bring along a draftsman, a rarity which will not be easy to find. He must be a landscape painter, but also able to depict figures correctly and accurately, especially the Indians." Bodmer's reaction to the prince's offer. "I do not doubt that there are many painters who would accept the prince's conditions without objection to be able to go on an interesting journey." A lukewarm reaction, maybe, but there was a reason. Essentially, Bodmer's life became the story of this one fortuitous offer. Later in his life, post-America, he had a somewhat successful career in France as a painter of animals and forest scenes. But in terms of fame and an enduring reputation, Bodmer today is pretty much a one-hit band, and the Missouri River in 1833-34 is the hit. Maximilian not only gave Bodmer his one major trip abroad, it was a trip that took him farther into darkest North America than any artist had gone until then. When they arrived in St. Louis, the gateway to the West, Maximilian began to waffle about whether to explore the southern or the northern West. The Santa Fe Trail was now open, and stories he heard about New Mexico were compelling. But a fur company offer of a Missouri River passage aboard steamboats and keelboats as far as Fort McKenzie, within sight of the Rockies, decided Maximilian on the Missouri. From his uncle, who had studied with some of Switzerland's most prominent artists, Bodmer had learned some valuable time machine lessons. In contrast to Catlin, who painted so rapidly he sometimes had brushes in both hands, Bodmer was dedicated and careful, often spending an entire day on a single piece. The simple truth is that Karl Bodmer could paint the Western trifecta, landscapes, animals, and native people, better than just about anybody else who went west. For the full time machine effect, sometimes spend slow, deliberate time in good light with a book like Karl Bodmer's America. The range of the guy's skill is breathtaking. While he's most famous now for his Indian portraits, and I adore his landscapes, he probably was best of all portraying wildlife. His portraits of the grand creatures of the West are unexpected and remarkable. Bodmer's bison, whooping crane, coyote, vulture, bighorn sheep, pronghorns, mule deer, elk, all come across in an effortless and observant perfection. Two of his finished watercolors of wildlife, Landscape with Herd of Buffalo on the Upper Missouri and Buffalo and Elk on the Upper Missouri, are scenes from 1830s life it's hard to recreate even in Yellowstone or in Western movies. As for what the country looked like, the first time I saw Bodmer's great finished watercolor landscapes, the White Castles of the Missouri, the first chain of the Rocky Mountains above Fort McKenzie, and most particularly, view of the Bear Paw Mountains from Fort McKenzie, I thought he captured the early West with its immense feel of uninterrupted space and an unmarred, pellucid blue atmosphere better than anything I'd ever imagined. Every time I look at those pieces, I still think that. From a standpoint of pure nostalgic emotion at what has been lost, Bodmer's view of the Bear Paw Mountains is one of the truest Western landscape paintings of all time. But the body of work that keeps Bodmer's name alive is his marvelous portfolio of the Indians of the Upper Missouri, Arikaras, Hidatsas, Mandans, Crees, Assiniboines, Blackfeet. He rendered them all, and with a discipline and attention to detail that made Catlin seem an eager amateur by comparison. During the course of Maximilian's and Bodmer's Missouri adventure, they spent 5 weeks among the Blackfeet, Assiniboines, and Crees at Fort McKenzie, where Bodmer did some of his most remarkable work among Indians that Catlin didn't even visit, although the following year Catlin would return the favor by painting Southern Plains Indians Bodmer never saw. There were other regrets. Maximilian's original plan was to winter at this rude outpost and penetrate the Rockies the following spring. As European alpinists, he and Bodmer were fascinated by mountains, and there the Rockies were, so tantalizingly close. But hostilities between the Blackfeet and their enemies discouraged that choice. Somewhat reluctantly, the Europeans returned downriver to the Mandan villages that autumn of 1833. And here they spent the winter, giving Bodmer an opportunity for one of the most haunting visual portrayals in the early West. What they couldn't know was that there among the Mandans, Bodmer was preserving for the future the appearance and vitality and lived experiences of a people who would all be dead within 3 years. In the winter of 1833-34, though, the Mandans and their great leader, Matatope, had no inkling of their fate. Bodmer's methodical work habits now captured scenes, ceremonies, material culture, and confident, happy faces that turned out to be horrifyingly fragile when smallpox stalked the river's shores in the year 1837. As it turned out, Bodmer really was a one-hit wonder. Nothing in his subsequent long life indicates that he had any desire for additional historic adventures. He settled in Paris in 1836, and with Maximilian's help was able to put on an exhibit of his scenes of the West. The reception was disappointing. Efforts to get a published version of the Missouri River adventure into print were also difficult. The price of the printed version, with complete aquatints of Bodmer's watercolors, was staggering, exceeding the annual income of all but the very wealthy in Europe. In the 1840s, Maximilian offered Bodmer the chance to accompany him on an expedition to the Caucasus Mountains and Asian Russia. Bodmer refused. He followed that in 1846 by turning down a chance to join a government-sponsored expedition to Egypt. No interest in Egypt? Jealous of George Catlin's successes with his book and traveling exhibit of Indian and Western scenes, Bodmer decided that what he really wanted to do was to throw himself into portraying the animals of what he called the primeval German forest before they vanish entirely from the face of the earth. Eventually, he relocated from Paris to an art colony in Cologne, where he spent his life painting animals, publishing books, and illustrating books for others, including one by Victor Hugo. Karl Bodmer died in Paris in 1883, exactly half a century after his time in the West. In the mid-20th century, Pulitzer Prize-winning Western writer Bernard DeVoto rediscovered Bodmer and reacquainted native peoples with him. Descendants of the Indian peoples Bodmer once painted then utilized his time machine visuals to help them recover their ancestors, their clothing, customs, and history. Hollywood has done the same in a variety of films, including Dances with Wolves. I think the most powerful use of Bodmer's portfolio from the early 1830s West has been far more widespread, though. Simply by providing those of us farther along in history with a remarkable visual record of what the West was once like, Bodmer has enabled generations since to experience that world. Canoeing down the wild and scenic stretch of the Missouri River, I've taken copies of Bodmer's works along to compare to what's there now and to study and wonder by firelight. As Maximilian wrote to a friend in Europe, "If only I could show you Mr. Bodmer's portfolio, how many times would you exclaim, 'Oh, excellent, beautiful, beautiful.' He now has 70 pages of sketches from which you will be able to travel very vividly." Just so, I think. For almost 200 years now, George Catlin's and Karl Bodmer's time machine visuals have enabled untold thousands of us from another century to travel very vividly indeed. Not just from Europe to America, but back in time and into the early 19th century American West. What a gift to pass on to the future.
So, Dan, we've been working on a couple projects lately, one on the Mountain Men we just released in January, and now we're working on one on the buffalo hide hunt. And in the Mountain Men, I kept bumping into Catlin, references to Catlin. Obviously, like, he's this figure that captures this moment in time.
Yeah.
And then the other day I was reading old newspapers, and I read this fantastic description of a hunt, when I get to the end of it, and it's signed George Catlin, and it was a letter that he'd sent to the editors of this paper. And so I think my one thing that's always struck me about him is just how prolific he was. And in my mind, he's sort of this faceless wealth of information, this fountain of information from the West. But I thought was, at least for me, I was interested by your descriptions of sort of the interpersonal rivalries that these guys had. Because
I wasn't aware that they're always hacking on each other. And stuff. It was like,
well, that was a shock to
me. Yeah,
because for me, Catlin is kind of just like this very even keeled sort of tell it like it is, almost like a Walter Cronkite type figure. But this was sort of
and all the dudes are like, he ain't all that,
right?
Yeah. Yeah, he's a pretty startlingly obscure figure for a lot of people, given how present he was in the 19th century. As you say, you can kind of just read, some 1830s newspaper article and be shocked by the fact, well, George Catlin submitted this piece. And his famous book, Letters and Notes, which is in 2 volumes, by the way, on the North American Indians, essentially that's what that book is. It's these sort of newspaper-length stories that he was sending into newspapers in the East, along with his quickly done watercolors to illustrate them, and he assembled those ultimately into a book. So he should be probably a lot better known than he is. But you're right. One of the things that is true of his career is that a lot of the other painters of the time, Alfred Jacob Miller, Bodmer himself, the Swiss artist who is also a feature in this particular episode, and especially John James Audubon, they kind of think of Catlin as this quack figure. And they say very unkind things about him. Evidently one of the common words of opprobrium back in the 19th century was humbug.
Which I thought was strictly, Ebenezer Scrooge. I didn't know that other people would run around saying humbug too. I had no idea.
Yeah.
I thought that was a Charles Dickens.
We should bring it back.
It sounds like Dickens, but it actually predates Dickens because George Catlin got it a lot. It's just humbug, he's just, that was just a bunch of bullshit. He's a complete loser. And, and then Audubon says that strange thing about him. He could have been an honest man. I feel sorry for him. He could have been an honest man. Now, I will say about Audubon, because one of the episodes is going to be about Audubon, and I talk about this a little bit. Audubon was not generous about other people. He tended to be kind of jealous of everybody else who ever made any kind of accomplishments. So that can be discounted a little bit. But Karl Bodmer in Europe, because Catlin is the guy he's the first American who has a traveling exhibit of the West in Europe in the 1830s and 1840s. And a ton of Europeans who end up coming to America acquire their fascination with the West by going to George Catlin's Indian Gallery. And Catlin took 3 or 4 native people with him, sort of like, Buffalo Bill did with his Wild West. He took native people with him and they did ceremonies on stage. And yet even Bodmer, who is a European himself, encouraged his friends not to go see Catlin's show. So Catlin was clearly a guy who was maybe a little too successful in winning over followers, and yet at the same time, he did something pretty remarkable. I mean, he went up the Missouri River with the fur trading companies, usually on their steamboats. That was a safe way for these people who wanted to go west to travel. And he basically painted portraits of half the native people in the West. And of course, he is famous among conservationists these days because he's the first American to ever call for a national park. He wants the government to create a national park on the Great Plains. But what he wants is a different kind of national park than we think of today. I mean, we created national parks in Yellowstone and Glacier and kindly invited the native people to leave. Catlin wants a national park where it's all about the native people still practicing their original culture and hunting the animals they hunted. And so he has a different idea about a national park, but he does get credit for being the first person to ever propose one in America.
I thought about that in your episode, and I had read that about Catlin before. And it seemed like an outlandish idea until I thought about this. Around the world, there are a handful of examples of kind of what he was talking about.
Oh, yeah.
You go there's autonomous zones. So along the border with Afghanistan and Pakistan, you have what they call the tribal areas or autonomous zones. In Brazil, near the Brazil border with Colombia, you have autonomous zones, which are like hunter-gatherer groups doing their own government. They're living within a geopolitical boundary, but their crimes aren't investigated. Their own system of government prevails in their area.
Yeah.
Sentinel Island in the Pacific.
Nicaragua has one.
Where it's like you're within a broader geopolitical bound, but there is a place where like native culture.
Yeah.
The difference there is what makes those places work is that you don't visit.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So this idea that it would be like for people to come see, that people would be able to go and see all this, right? And then the biggest challenge today with creating these autonomous tribal areas is that we now know you can't go look. Because when you go look, you're going to bring disease and you're going to bring ideas. And some people think it's like overly paternalistic on the part of the governments, but it winds up being that it's like you don't visit.
No, that's true. And I mean, I know you know this because you've traveled everywhere and seen these. And that's been a fairly recent trend with national parks. National parks obviously got interpreted in a different way than Catlin proposed. And then we exported the idea of the national park around the world. So there are places like Kruger National Park, for example, in South Africa, where the idea was to get the native people out of the park because European and American tourists seeing the park would not want to see the native people. They would want to see the landscapes and the animals.
Natural.
But not the native people there. And of course, what the zones you're describing were sort of a reaction against that, where the idea is to remove the native people. And so, it's back in the direction of what Catlin was proposing in 1832. But he does have this idea appended to his proposal that enlightened and civilized people
would go see
and get to see these people live just the way he had gotten to do in the 1830s. But he's, as I tried to say in that episode, I think one of the reasons he comes in for the kind of derogation that he does is because he's more sympathetic to native people than most other Americans are at the time. And we have a lot of Americans come to a different interpretation of the European notion, the Rousseau notion of the noble savage living in a state of nature. For Catlin, these native people are the noble savages. For a lot of Americans, we sort of translated that into, well, it's actually a white American who lives like an Indian.
Daniel Boone.
Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, the Mountain Men, those are the noble savages. Or in, John James Audubon's viewpoint, he was the noble savage who would go to Europe and present himself to the Europeans as, here's an American living in a state of nature, a true noble savage, but not the Indians. And that became that critical break point between a lot of the other people of his time and Catlin and even Bodmer. And Bodmer's thing, I don't know what you guys thought about that part of it, but to me, his big role is, he not only is able to paint landscapes and animals and people in a remarkably realistic way, so it's kind of a time travel thing to experience the West of the early 1830s. But what made Bodmer a sort of a modern phenomenon is Bernard DeVoto's discovery of him. When Bernard DeVoto was writing Across the Wide Missouri, he discovered Bodmer's work and realized this was the most authentic Western work of Indians and wildlife and landscapes he had found, and kind of turned Bodmer into this official historian that Native people attempting to reacquire their cultures, and especially Hollywood trying to do films that would more realistically portray Native people, they turned to Bodmer. One of the films from my youth, A Man Called Horse, used one of the wonderful wild turkey headdresses that Bodmer portrayed among the Assiniboines, and they actually reproduced that headdress in that particular film.
Off his painting, yeah.
Yeah, off his painting. Mm-hmm. And they do the same thing in Dances with Wolves. They use a lot of his work to recreate the Indian attire and all that. So it's, as I was trying to say, these guys give us this kind of visual time machine of being able to go back and see the West. Lewis and Clark write about it, and you can certainly develop a good sense of what the West in the early 19th century was like from the literature, but the visual, I think, is, it's why movies work so well these days.
This isn't a question, but rather a comment of what you're talking about is dealing in these eras when there's no photography. You're really at the mercy and understanding of time. You're at the mercy of oftentimes one or two illustrators.
Yeah.
And it gets in your head that it looked that way. And when I was a little kid, I was growing up in the Great Lakes. I was very interested in early Great Lakes history. And the French, like the 1500s, early 1600s, terrible, terrible art. Where they would kind of draw these pictures of like everything that goes on.
Yeah.
And they would draw native peoples, and they'd like grotesque renditions of native peoples,
Oh no, I've seen these kind of things.
And I would always have the idea that like I honestly was not drawn to the history because I couldn't escape how the French drew it.
Uh-huh.
And I'm like, that doesn't look cool.
No. I
just would be in your head.
Yeah, that's a great way.
Like someone like Catlin, you look at Catlin, you're like, man, that looks awesome. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'll go there.
Catlin and Bodmer both, man. So this is a very different art than those guys who would do a page and sort of put animals all over it. And
like
trees
everything that goes on, like little chores. It was just
stick it all over the place.
There's nothing that drew you in about it. In your head, you like, if you went back in time, it would all look like that drawing.
Yeah. That stuff is closer to like the drawings from the colonial period of these animals that don't look like animals. Trees that don't look like trees.
Yeah. A buffalo that looks like a lion and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, well, these guys were, Catlin, especially Bodmer, these guys were incredible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so it really is a way to sort of, if you're interested in that sort of thing, and I always have been, just like you were interested in the Great Lakes, I've always been interested in trying to recreate. So what was this like? What would it have been like to go up the Missouri River and see the White Cliffs? And so, as I said later in that script, one of the things I did first time I went down the wild and scenic Missouri and went through the White Cliffs section, I took Bodmer paintings with me. Man.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I shot photographs of them and printed them up in color and took them along, took about 15 of them along and just kind of rode along in a canoe and held these paintings up. And I mean,
that's
he was really good at portraying that landscape. So that's one of the things that gave me the idea for a piece like this, is knowing how accurately he did it.
Yeah. Getting back to Catlin and Native people, I think, and this isn't unique to the West, but oftentimes when people are looking at the past, they're sort of viewing individuals' beliefs on a spectrum of how enlightened they are versus how backwards they are, right? Yeah. And one of the things that I've picked up just in reading about this period is it's the thinking about Native people and Native cultures at the time is so multidimensional. You know, there's some people that maybe celebrate Native culture, but they believe that they're going to go extinct. There's some people that are obviously, like, there's some that, you know, don't view it positively and want to wipe out Native people. There's some people that are trying to sort of taking a paternalistic attitude and trying to save them. And then even in the realm of science, you know, like you mentioned in the last episode, questions about whether indigenous people in the Americas were part of a separate creation, whether they were a separate, you know, or they were part of the same race or species. I wonder if you can sort of get into where, like, Catlin in particular, one could read his idea of having parks with people in them as being very backwards. But in terms of the context, you know, it's sort of hard to make a judgment value about that,
No,
right?
I mean, Randall, that's all excellent points, no doubt about it. Yeah, it's complicated, and there are people with a lot of different approaches to it. I mean, and we're still debating by the 1830s when Catlin and Bodmer in the West. I mean, we're still debating. I mean, this is the same decade when Joseph Smith writes the Book of Mormon, which is, you know, a postulation of the old idea that who Native people are actually Hebrews from the lost tribes of Israel who found their way to the Americas. I mean, that's what the Book of Mormon basically posits as its story. And that was an early explanation for who Indians were when Europeans first came over. Well, who are these people? Because they don't appear anywhere in our stories. Why are there people here who we know nothing about? And this was the best guess, was that, well, there are some tribes from the lost tribes of Israel who left and disappeared, and maybe that's who this is. But in terms of science, by that same decade, though, there were already people who were doing linguistic studies of tribal languages and beginning to argue that these tribal languages don't seem to have any relationship to Hebrew at all. In fact, what they appear to be closest to are the languages of Asia, not of the Middle East. And therefore, by the 1830s, there are already people who are saying, well, it looks like maybe Native people must have come from Asia and not from somewhere in the Middle East or Europe. That's kind of one of the scientific arguments that's at the time that Catlin and Bodmer are doing all this work. You know, but to give you an idea of Catlin's commitment to what he thought by creating a park with Native people in it would have been a great good for Native people, Catlin is one of the only people I've ever read about who personally went to the White House and got an audience with Andrew Jackson and tried to talk Andrew Jackson out of removing Indians in the East to the West. I mean, he actually tried to engage with a president of the United States who was not about to, of course, stop removal, and tried to make the case that you shouldn't do this. And the reason he thought that Jackson shouldn't do it, he said, we all should be growing up around Native people. We shouldn't shunt them off to somewhere else and hide them away from the rest of us. We should all have Native people around us. And, you know, that's, again, a kind of an argument that you're hard-pressed to find anybody else of the time making. And so as I said in that the script for that episode, I kind of think that it's these ideas that get Catlin in trouble with a lot of his contemporaries.
Yeah, but if you're going to condemn Catlin's thing as being, viewing Native people strictly as an other, wanting to like make museum exhibits out of them, like I don't think it's really fair to do it that way, because you have to look at it in the context of what everybody else was saying at the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And when you compare it to what everybody else's idea, it was revolutionary. Do you know what I mean? And it was born like from sympathy.
It was born from sympathy.
And you can look at it now and find all these ways to tear it apart, but you gotta be like, well, if you're gonna do that, then you better compare what Jackson's idea was.
And Jackson's idea was the same thing that the liberation societies for manumitted African slaves was, which is, we're going to send them back to Africa. We don't want them to remain here. If they're free now, they go. And so we acquire a piece of West Africa, Liberia, and start sending former slaves back to Africa. And Jackson's idea with Native people was essentially the same thing. We're going to designate a piece of the United States, Oklahoma,
not where they live,
the Indian Territory, and we're going to put them all there so we can get them out of the rest of the country. And Catlin is one of the few voices that's arguing against that. So, yeah, absolutely. Given the context of the time, this guy is a raging liberal trying to defend the rights of Native people in the 1830s.
Yeah. Well, Dan, thanks, man. Look forward to the next episode.
Oh, thank you, Stephen. Randall, appreciate it.